The world looks to California to answer the hard questions, for redemption, to introduce the unfamiliar, to be resilient. Because California bounces back, holds us accountable, values who we are, remains vigilant, defies those in our way, and stands for community. Here on the West Coast, we're at the center of it all. Los Angeles Times, the state of what's next.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Liam Dillon. I'm a reporter with the Los Angeles Times. I write about the issues of housing affordability and neighborhood change across California. I've been with the Times since 2016, and before my current assignment, which is based in LA, I worked out of our state capitol bureau in Sacramento covering state politics and policy. So welcome to Ask a Reporter. This is our live meetup series where LA Times reporters and editors discuss the news and answer your questions about current issues, behind the scenes action, and the stories that we cover. Tonight, I'm here with two of my colleagues to discuss some of the most pressing housing issues in Los Angeles and California right now. Andrew Khouri covers the housing market for our business section, and Erika Smith is a columnist on our California team. Thanks to both of you for being with us. And Andrew, why don't you start off by introducing yourself?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Liam. Good to see you. Yeah, I'm Andrew Khouri. I cover housing on our business section, and write about a wide range of housing topics. Oftentimes exploring what homeowners and renters pay for housing and sort of why that's so expensive. And since the pandemic has hit, been keeping an eye on the struggles of landlords, small mom and pop landlords and tenants, as well as the difficulties homeowners have had with mortgage relief programs, and the direction of both home prices and rents, and now kind of watching what's happening with this coming eviction cliff.
And Erika, how about you?
Yeah, so thanks, Liam, for the introduction. As you mentioned, I am a columnist with the LA Times. I've been with the Times now for almost almost 2 years, not 10. And right now I'm covering the state of California, looking at a lot of equity issues given the pandemic and given some of the recent things that have happened as far as the national reckoning on race. But before being a columnist, I was an editor of our housing and homelessness coverage. So I have a deep interest in this topic, and particularly how it affects affecting the state of California. As many of you know, we have one of the highest rates of homelessness in the country, particularly a number of people who are living outdoors. And so obviously this eviction crisis and this eviction cliff, as we're calling it, could have a disastrous effect on California. But I was wondering if we could get started and Liam, you are the expert on this. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what this eviction cliff is and why it's happening and how it would affect renters, and maybe Andrew could chime in about homeowners as well.
Sure. So yeah, so I think we're using the phrase eviction cliff, but it's also been known as the wave of evictions or potential eviction tsunami. So obviously, with that kind of evocative language, it's a big deal. And so, why is this a cliff, and what are we talking about? So, in less than 2 weeks, on September 1st, the California court system is scheduled to resume processing eviction and foreclosure cases that they had halted in response to the COVID-19 pandemic months ago. And not only that, some major federal benefits, I think most notably the $600 a week expanded unemployment benefits, they've gone away. And many people had been using that money to keep current on their rent up to this point. So the fear is, after September 1st, potentially millions of California renters could be facing eviction when they can't afford to pay their rent. And so are you or your family member dealing with an uncertain housing situation right now? So on this show, we're here to answer your questions. Please share them in the replies and comments wherever you're watching, and we'll do our best to answer them. And before we kind of jump in to get everyone's thoughts on what they've been hearing from and talking to folks around the state about this potential eviction and foreclosure crisis, I just want to give a couple more stats to put this in context. So there was a recent study from the Aspen Institute, which is a think tank, and some academics and housing advocates chimed in, that estimated about 40 million people nationwide could be at risk of eviction in the coming months. And just for some context, 40 million people is the equivalent to the population of the entire state of California, right? And in California, that same study estimated those who are at risk are between about 4 million and about 5.5 million people statewide. So a huge number of folks here. And then also, I think it's important to note that these evictions are likely to disproportionately affect Black, Latino, and other non-white Californians. There was a study that came out relatively recently from the Turner Center, which is a organization that's based out of UC Berkeley. And they estimated about 3/4 of the nearly 1 million renter households affected by coronavirus-related job losses in the state include at least one Black, Latino, Asian, or other person of color, according to that study. So maybe we can start. Andrew, why don't you talk about what you've been hearing from folks that you've been speaking with, and particularly not just from tenants, but also from landlords as well.
Yep, sure. I mean, tenants are obviously extremely fearful of what comes after September 1st. Especially with the removal of the $600 and extra unemployment and nothing to replace it. In terms of landlords, if you talk to them, they say that, they're not going to sort of rush in to evict everyone, and that eviction can be expensive, and they would like to try to come up with some deals if they can. Furthermore, the tenant's attorney I was speaking with the other day is that some of the court system moves slowly, and so it doesn't mean that all of a sudden people will be, facing an eviction trial, on September 1st. But the question is, if people don't know their rights and tenants don't know their rights, that they might just leave anyway and be forced to find housing in a pandemic, and then which could be very bad.
Right. And when you for landlords, there's been some relief that's been offered in the terms of form of forbearance. Can you just describe to people what forbearance is?
Sure. Forbearance is essentially a delay in your mortgage payment. If you enter a forbearance plan, landlords have been able to have them as well as homeowners. You basically don't have to pay your mortgage for a given time period. And then eventually you will have to pay that back. And then the question is how you pay that back. And there's been a lot of confusion over that.
Right. Okay. And Erika, you've talked to a lot of renters and about their concerns. What have you been hearing?
Well, yeah, it's interesting because I, as a renter myself, I'm a mildly concerned, but I think renters are in general pretty worried about this overall. And as you mentioned, it's going to be disproportionately Black and Latino renters that would be affected, which not so or notably are the same groups of folks in California who are most affected by COVID. So it's kind of a double whammy. It would be kind of a double whammy for people. But I think people are just generally concerned about keeping their jobs. They're concerned about not being able to pay their rent. I think people have already been concerned, even with that $600 coming through. And obviously, the state has had some problems distributing unemployment funds, which is complicated matters for a number of people as well. So just because the federal government has given people that extra $600 doesn't mean that people have actually received that money. And so, I think there's just this general worry and fear on top of all these other things that people are dealing with, such as, trying to figure out what to do with their kids as far as school, trying not to get COVID, worrying about having to go to work and being exposed, and just general, trying to get by living paycheck to paycheck. So this is just one more thing. And I think that the fact that the legislature has dragged this out so long has just, complicated matters, because as of last week, the Judicial Council could have started processing evictions again. So as Andrew mentioned, it wouldn't have necessarily been like a crush of evictions, though some experts I've talked to have feared that exactly what would happen and what will happen. So I think there's just a lot of uncertainty out there. And I do think it's complicated by the fact that we have so many homeless people already. If you're talking about 5.5 million Californians evicted, we have at last count probably going on like 175,000 homeless people is on the streets. But
and those counts were before the pandemic even began. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And on top of that, right now we've had a lot of cities that have managed to get people off the streets and into hotel rooms, and it's just congregate shelters. But as some of our colleagues have reported this week, we have some of those shelters closing. And so, that emergency funding is already starting to go back down. And so I don't know if it's going to be a return to the status quo, but there's definitely, I would say, more concern about what housing and affordable housing is going to look like in California in another 6 months or less.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, the fact that we're talking about an eviction cliff means that we know it's coming. Tenants and landlords are certainly aware that potentially this is coming. That also means that politicians are aware that this is coming, potentially coming. And I think there had been a thought. Erika, you referenced the state legislature, but both the state legislature and the federal government have been involved in trying to add some protections or some financial relief. And it just is, as I mentioned at the top, those things are kind of running out. So just a summary, there was after the CARES Act, which passed in March, the beginning of the pandemic, that's what added the $600 extra a week in unemployment benefits. That expired at the end of July. I think there was a lot of thought that the federal government would pass something again to renew some relief, both financially and potentially for eviction protections. But that has not happened. House Democrats passed a bill. The Senate has not taken it up, and the president is now, involved, I guess, in negotiating. But there's been nothing that's sort of firmly that's passed, and now they're on recess and out to after Labor Day. And so the cavalry is not coming in California from the federal government. That seems to be clear. And then the state legislature, they're now have less than 2 weeks. Their session ends, their year ends. the end of August. And so there are some proposals on the table, but no firm deal, nothing close to coming up with a plan that would take care of both renters and landlords. Are you either of you surprised that there's not been anything kind of firm that's happened to this point, given that we've sort of all seen this kind of cliff, or all seen this kind of ball rolling down a hill? Either of you want to weigh in?
I mean, I'm not. I mean, I guess I should be shocked, and I guess part of me is just, I don't know if shocked is the word. I think I'm just disgusted. I mean, I think in general with our own legislature, but also with Congress. I mean, and the inability to get anything done. But I think, to me, I look at it as not just this cliff has been coming since March. I mean, this is the culmination of like years upon years upon years of taking bites around the edges of our housing problems in this state.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's
not, I mean, people are, I forget the statistic out of LA County, but basically it boils down to like twice as many people become homeless as they do get off the street, like every day in LA County, because mostly because they can't afford a place to live. And so, and that's been a situation that's been going on for like a long time. This is not new. It's just that COVID has made it very immediate because of obviously the pandemic, the economy, and all of these things happening at the same time. It's like a perfect storm. And, I had a column I wrote a week and a half ago or so. I was talking to some of the homeless providers here in LA County, and, they've been sounding the alarm about these various different issues for years. And, now it's like the urgency of we have to do something, or there's literally going to be like 1 million some homeless people on the streets. Like now it's like this urgency, but it's still like the last minute. I mean, it's what, August 20, what is the day? The 21st. And it's like, they have like to the end of the month to avoid complete catastrophe. Right. So it's kind of like, it's like, I don't know how much more last minute you can get, but I think we're going to try.
Right. I think part of the reason why this pandemic or these massive job losses are so sort of immediately effective when it comes to potential people on being able to pay their rent is because a lot of people were struggling to pay their rent in the first place. I mean, some of the stats before this pandemic, half the renter population in the state, so about 9.5 million tenants, 17 million total, about 9.5 million, were already paying by census stats more than 30% of their income on rent. And that's the sort of federal standard for when your housing spending begins to crowd out the rest of your other spending. And so people were already on the edge. And here with this sort of little push, right, or I guess big push, to be clear, that's why people are really worried, I think, about folks sort of being pushed over this ledge. So Andrew, maybe you can talk a little bit now about what you're hearing from homeowners and how they're affected, and what some of their options for relief are.
Yeah, sure. I mean, homeowners obviously are affected as well. If you look at some of the data, they have been less affected from tenants. The homeowners tend to be better off financially, and in terms of the hard hit industries, the service industries in California, a lot of those people were less likely to own a home. But there are many homeowners out there that can't pay their mortgage, or are really struggling to pay their mortgage. And so, they're fearful that they could lose their house, that they could, go through a foreclosure, that would, ruin their credit, to lose, so much that they worked hard to get that house for. And some of the things that are out there, there's a decent amount of help out there for homeowners, particularly have a federally backed mortgage, say one that's backed by Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac or the FHA or the VA. You can go through one of these forbearance programs that was set up by the CARES Act, and can actually delay your payment for up to a year. And that can't be reported on your credit. And you have a year to, hopefully get finances or find a job. And hopefully at the end of that, things are better. There's been a lot of confusion about how you'll have to pay those missed payments back, because you will. But the federal government has come out and repeatedly said that, if you have a federally backed mortgage, you will not have to pay it all in a lump sum, which is what a lot of people feared. And in a lot of cases, you might just be able to throw it onto the back of the mortgage, at the end of the term. If you have a so-called private mortgage, it's not as guaranteed in terms of the help you will get, but a lot of those mortgage servicers have also offered forbearance programs and or even extending them, I'm hearing. So even though a year isn't guaranteed, they are extending them if you're still having trouble paying your mortgage.
So I'm going to jump to a reader question, and this is from Vince, and Vince brings up an issue that I was hoping we were going to discuss anyway, and so thanks for the question, Vince. And he asks, can you clarify what is happening in LA regarding the judicial review decision or the court systems? He said, I had read that large cities have passed their own specific laws that would still be in effect. And this is a good question. You know, I think at the beginning of the pandemic, what ended up happening is there was a real patchwork of ordinances and regulations that were passed at the federal level, the state level, and the local level across California. And so, yes, it is correct that the city of LA and the county of LA have their own specific eviction protections. But there are still people, I think, both on the landlord-tenant side, when it comes to the city of LA's protections in particular, and I'm answering this because I've written about this, where people are really, really worried. And I think, and on the tenant side, it's that LA's protection does say that if you've been financially affected, lost your job, lost your income, have gotten sick, or something else as a result of the coronavirus, you cannot be evicted. But the issue is what that is not a sort of a blanket ban, but rather a defense that you would have to raise if your landlord were to take you to court. And so there's a lot of worry. And if you look at the statistics, very, very few tenants actually have lawyers when they go to court in eviction cases, right? So there's a lot of fear that tenants won't be able to assert these rights if they have them, or assert that defense if they have them, if the landlord were to take them to court. So that on the tenant side, I think, and tenant activist side, that's the worry. And I think on the other side, on the landlord side, you know, these rules also say that landlords can't enforce repayment of rent until a year after the coronavirus state of emergency were to end. And so in theory, that might mean, say I'm a tenant who has not paid or did not pay my rent starting in April of this past year, and say the state of emergency ends in January. That means that my landlord, in theory, could not collect, not evict me, not enforce that collection of my April 2020 rent until January of 2022, right? And so there are a lot of landlords who are like, wait a second, that's way too long. I have mortgages, I have property taxes. This doesn't work for me either. And so, yes, you know, Vince, you are correct. There are protections, not just LA City, but I guess roughly a third of jurisdictions in the state have passed some level of protection, but a lot of them have these sort of gaps in them that I think people are looking to the state and to the federal government to potentially try to fill. And maybe I could bring in Erika here. You know, you wrote some and talked to an author of a study that came out of UCLA that sort of spoke to this very point. Kind of, you know, the authors sort of noted that yes, there are these sort of eviction rules in LA, but because of the gaps, particularly on the tenant side, they were worried about people falling through that.
Yeah, I mean, I think to your point just a few minutes ago when you were talking about just the level of the various different patchwork, I think that alone is confusing. I mean, frankly, there's a lot of people in LA that don't know whether they live in the county or the city. So imagine trying to figure out what rules apply to you in your residence. I mean, if you don't even know that basic fact. But yes, you're right. I did talk to the author of Gary Blasey, who authored a study earlier on just about this eviction cliff. And one of the interesting things was that, you know, particularly on the tenant side, the advent of being able to file evictions online, like talk about having attorneys, he was saying that he's already been hearing that landlords preparing for the cliff to end, and it was supposed to potentially end a few days ago. It did not, obviously, extend to the end of the month. But a lot of landlords were lining up attorneys preparing to basically file their eviction claims online at like 12:01 a.m. the day that ended. And so basically people would wake up and they would have a bunch of notices that they're being evicted. And at that point, you have, as a tenant, you have 5 days to respond, to which at which point you'd have to remount that defense that is allowed under the LA City and I believe the county statute as well, saying to prove, basically to prove that you are lost your job or lost income because of COVID, and that's why you haven't paid your rent. But if you don't respond in that 5 days, then you're automatically evicted. And this is where that overlapping, those disparities come in, considering that we have so many people, particularly in LA County, that do not speak English or enough English,
Right.
and they don't understand a legal document. And so they may not even realize they're receiving a notice, a court summons to be evicted. They certainly might not know how to find an attorney in 5 days, particularly
Right.
if you work 1 or 2 jobs and you have childcare. So you have the idea that a number of people are going to be forced out, even if it's legal. That's a very real thing. And so
Yeah.
in a place like LA County, that's not going to be probably would not be a very small number. It would probably be a very large number. And Liam, I know you did a story kind of looking at just illegal evictions and where they're happening in parts of South LA, and it
Right.
overlaps, pretty clearly with where some of the biggest spikes in COVID cases have been. And so, I mean, this particular author was talking about he thinks those same areas and neighborhoods would be affected if this cliff is reached. So, I mean, we know where it's going to happen, and we
Right.
know that there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be affected by this. So,
Yeah. Yeah. We just got this more of a comment than a question from a reader, Kwan, and I'm going to direct this one to Andrew. Kwan says, "How can my rent go up? My rent just went up in Los Angeles County, and there is some protections within the city of LA, and I believe the county as well. If you are in a rent stabilized apartment, so an apartment in LA City that was built prior to October 1978." If you're under that program, the city has halted rent increases during the pandemic, but there are obviously a lot of apartments that are not covered by rent control. And so yes, rents can go up. Landlords can do that if they would like. But Andrew, you've covered both home prices and rents and what has been happening during the pandemic with them. And it sounds like you're more likely to get a rent decrease or more likely to see lower rents on the market than you are to see those rents going up, right? At this point.
That's what it seems, and it kind of depends what area you're in and what type of building you have. But it does. The data does indicate that rents on a whole are declining in Los Angeles County. Not huge declines. On an average, maybe 4%. In some areas, it's been like downtown at around 8 or 10%. What seems to be happening is sort of those declines have been kind of focused on the higher end of the market and the more luxurious buildings. Kind of think your kind of newer buildings with a pool and a side cabana and barbecues and things like that.
Sure.
Which has been explained to me is you have a lot of new supply coming on in those areas, and as the pandemic has hit, with the reason why a lot of people pay kind of very, very expensive rents to live in a city is not kind of as attractive anymore. So
Right.
maybe they did lose their jobs, or do you really want to be paying $3,000 for one bedroom when you can't maybe go to the shared pool, or you can't walk outside of your apartment and go to the restaurant or go
Right.
see a movie or something like that. On the lower end of the market, where arguably tenants might need those rent declines the most, just doesn't seem to have seen the declines that the top end has. And there's landlords will explain that, and analysts will say, well, there's just a lot more demand for such units.
Right.
If someone leaves, someone will be way quicker to backfill those cheaper units, given our housing situation and how many people are struggling, and then the demand for as if it's not affordable, the lowest cost rent you can get.
Right. I think we were seeing it anecdotally. Andrew and I both lives in a West LA kind of Palms neighborhood, and walking around. I don't know if you've seen this too, but I mean, I see all the new properties. 8 weeks free. If you sign up, right, and then a lot more vacancy signs than I had seen. Since I first moved here. Are you seeing similar stuff when you're walking around, Erika?
yeah, definitely. I mean, we don't live too far from each other, but there's definitely a number of the free rent for 8 weeks, or whatever kind of deals, or free parking for a year, or and definitely lots of vacancy signs. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it is kind of interesting to see what rent is going to do, and and I can understand the idea of the value proposition, right? Like if you're paying $3,000, as Andrew mentioned, for a 1-bedroom apartment in a place with a pool and a gym, but you can't use either one. I mean, you could go move into like a single family house with 2 bedrooms and pay the same amount and have parking. So it's kind of like, it's a trade-off. I expect, and I will say in my building, I've seen quite a few moving vans it's almost been a nonstop parade of them for the last 3 weeks, which has been very interesting. And I don't really know what to make of that. But people are apparently moving in a pandemic. So that's no deterrent, which you wrote about actually at the, what's the name of that building? The massive
Park La Brea.
Park La Brea, yeah.
Park La Brea, the largest housing complex west of the Mississippi River. Yes.
Yeah, interesting statistic. I did not know, but yes. So people are definitely moving, and I think they're definitely looking for bigger deals. And even you mentioned in that story, like people were moving within the complex because there were deals that they could just get a bigger or different apartment, right, to get out of their lease, kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry. Yeah.
No, I was gonna say I have a question for you. Actually, I was wondering if you. Because we talked about this cliff, but we haven't really talked about what the legislature is actually doing, or not doing. And I was wondering if you could explain exactly what those two bills are, the two bills that are kind of working their way through, what they would actually do to kind of address the problem, so people understand.
Right. So there's a couple pieces of legislation, and I think to be clear, not both of them are not going to pass. The way this sort of typically works, and this is coming from my Sacramento experience, is that sometimes there are dueling pieces of legislation, and then when there's big issues, the governor gets involved. And in this situation, the governor Newsom has certainly indicated that he's going to get involved, and there's a sort of a deal cut. Now, this is a very hard deal to make, but I think that's the most likely outcome here, if they are going to do something. But there are two pieces of kind of legislation that are in the works now, still active. One is coming out of the Assembly, sort of the lower house, and that bill would essentially defer rent payments until after any missed rent payments due to the pandemic, until after the state of emergency ends. And then, even then, landlords could not evict you based on your missed rent during the pandemic. Instead, they could, say, take you to small claims court, right? So the money would still be owed, but it couldn't be used for an eviction. And part of that bill also is a mortgage relief program, mortgage forbearance program, and as a way to try to take care of some of landlords' expenses as well. So that's one of the bills. That's Assembly Bill 1436. David Hsu, the assemblyman from San Francisco, a Democrat, authored that. Then there's another bill, Senate Bill, 1410, I believe, and this is from Senator Ana Caballero from Salinas. And this bill is a little bit more towards the kind of the landlord's liking. The first bill was very much sort of pro-tenant, and while landlords have not really embraced this other option, they like this one better, in part because there's some more money attached to it, or some financial benefit attached to it. So like this one, tenants could not be evicted due to unpaid rent during coronavirus. But landlords, for that missed rent, would, in exchange, gets somewhat complicated very quickly, a state tax credit for the same amount of that overdue rent, right? So there's something the state is trying to do to take care of some of the financial obligations of landlords. And so that bill is also kind of, again, working its way through the legislature. They don't have very much time. As I said at the top, their session ends the end of August. And because they need something to take effect immediately, it is likely that they may need supermajority, so 2/3 of both houses of the legislature, to pass a bill. When you have a bill so that it would take effect immediately, when you have a situation like this, that's going to be very, very, very hard to do. There's potentially some ways around that, but not a lot of time to figure something out. Very sort of thorny issues, because someone ostensibly is going to be left holding the bag, right, of all this missed rent, right, and whoever that's going to be. And the state, not like the state is flush with money. I mean, they had working down this past year the budget at $54 billion with a B dollar deficit, and so that's really potentially problematic for providing some more funding that would kind of help this problem. And so I don't know what they're going to do. It's just a really hard, thorny problem that they're, I guess, in charge of figuring out, without much help, as we said, from the federal government. So that's the status there. So definitely keep an eye on what's happening in the legislature over the next week or so, because if they're going to make a deal, that's when it's going to happen. So we talked a little bit about rents going down slightly, but actually, so somewhat weirdly, the opposite seems to be happening with home prices. They seem to be increasing, right? Andrew, can you talk a little bit about what's going on there and why that might be happening?
So, you really see a divergence in the rental and the for sale housing market. And a lot of it has to do with, kind of the divergence we're seeing, this economic crisis and health crisis, impact different segments of American society. And so, a lot of the people that had jobs that were tending to buy homes in Southern California, given how expensive it was, are still have those jobs, might be working from home. They got, maybe they're spending a little bit less money because they're not going out, and they're buying homes. I mean, mortgage rates, the average rate on a 30-year fixed mortgage is down below 3%, last time I looked. And so there's really been a rush among the people that are still have the financial wherewithal to go out and purchase a home, to go do it and take advantage of those low rates. And some of them, you'll talk to real estate agents and homeowners, and some might be sitting in their cramped expensive apartment, or and they want more space, and so they're going out there, and maybe they put off buying a home for a while, and now seems like a great time to do it, and then get a little bit more space in a backyard, and so they're doing that. At the same time, you've seen listings, the amount of homes for sale have really fallen year over year, and so you just have this kind of increase of demand, less homes out there, a lot of cheap money, and prices are going up.
Yeah. Do you think it's more like that increase in demand, or that kind of stable, the folks who have kept their jobs and are able now to buy, or do you think it's simply because like that supply is significantly lower, in part because people don't want open houses and random people traipsing through their homes during a pandemic? How much of it do you think is can you going to weigh those both of those?
Yeah, I mean it's really hard to say, but it's a little bit of both. And a lot of people took their homes, as you mentioned, off the market at that time, around the coronavirus, because who wanted people going through their homes. And if you don't have to sell, the economy is going down, and you might be fearful, like, oh well, I'm just I don't want to sell into a bad market. But before the coronavirus had hit, the housing market was really heating up. It kind of had slowed about a year or so ago, as people kind of hit that limit about how much they can pay. But this year was seen before the economy go down as a year where home prices were starting to sort of accelerate once again. So it's probably a little bit of both demand and supply. How long all that lasts, who knows? I mean, unemployment in the state is in the teens, and some of these temporary job losses could increasingly become permanent, and you might even see that I think, forgetting California, but I think in the U.S. as well, you're starting to see overall unemployment rate go down, but sort of the permanent unemployment, people have permanently lost their jobs, sort of go up.
Right.
So the longer the economy is bad, the fewer amount of people that can pay a lot of money for a house.
Right. Erika, I want to switch to you. Some of your recent columns on this and talking about concerns about eviction focused on potential impact on children, and I'm hoping you can get a little bit into what you're seeing there, or what some of the worries are that folks who or kids who have been forced out of their homes, particularly now as sort of schools are starting again virtually, how that may affect them.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like, I think that a lot of people in California tend to think of homelessness and homeless people as adults and people who are living in encampments under freeway underpasses, or if you're in more rural areas like near rivers, or things like that, and people who have maybe a mental health issue that's unaddressed, or a substance abuse issue. In reality, I mean, there's a lot of hidden homelessness. There's lots of families that are homeless that are living and bouncing from motel to motel, or who are couch surfing, or sleeping in their cars, and hopefully in safe parking lots. But I think that for the most part, that's not our idea of visible homelessness. So what's going to be interesting if this cliff actually does happen is that the people that are going to be losing their homes are going to be families. It's not going to, I think, in the course of maybe a month, our idea of what is a homeless person is going to change, because we're going to start seeing a lot more families that are out there, particularly once hotel and motel rooms start to fill up, particularly if the state doesn't have enough money to kind of been doing what it's doing with Project Room Key, which is a state-run program to use federal dollars to rent hotel rooms and basically placed high-risk homeless into people who are high risk for catching COVID in hotel rooms. And that's already had some mixed level success depending on what market you're in. But I imagine some of that money, if this did happen, would be geared towards families. But some of these family shelters that are already stretched to the limits, who are delivering, food for people who can't get out, who are running food banks and are seeing lines that are wrapping around blocks. I mean, those are the folks that were already living on the bubble and are going to have a really hard time um, keeping a roof over their head, and could be the first in line for eviction. And I mean, I look at this as like this potential. After I wrote this column about this issue, and so one prediction put it around 120,000 kids in LA County alone.
Wow. Yeah.
That could end up being homeless, which is a huge number considering that. I mean, right now, I think the last count, and granted, this is a little bit squishy because it was pre-COVID, pre the time they started putting people in hotel rooms, but it was around 66,000 people on the streets or who are homeless in the city just overall. So you figure that's basically double the number of people who are actually homeless that we were able to count in the last point in time count in January. But yeah, so family shelters are really freaking out, and they barely have the capacity to deal with, or they don't have the capacity to deal with the current population as it is. So I don't even know if they could even wrap their brains around how they would be able to deal with that many people, particularly at a time when it's an economic downturn. The federal government hasn't provided additional funding for state and local governments. So we are pretty much on our own. And so, yeah, there's a lot of, and on top of that, a lot of those people are, again, the same folks that are either getting COVID at disproportionate rates because they're essential workers. And so, you can imagine the kind of nightmare scenario where you have tens of thousands of people on the street, many of them who have COVID. I mean, that's not going to be good for a pandemic. So in case we need yet another reason to keep people in their houses, that's a good one to do. So, I mean, it's a huge, huge problem, and with lots of different arms.
Right. Well, and again, as we've said, like the kids how are they going to go to school? I mean, there are already difficulties in going to school at this point because of the virtual situation. Then your housing situation is then disrupted, and that just adds another barrier to learning at a time when kids have been out of school out of in-person school for I guess a semester or since the spring, and it could well happen. It's happening again. Make it even worse.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it's overall it could be a complete public health type of disaster, which leads to I think the urgency of the factor. It was interesting. After I wrote that column, I got a number of emails from landlords who were very angry with me that I wasn't taking their side and didn't understand where they were coming from. And I do. Right. I mean, I do. I mean, I'm a renter, but my landlord is actually really awesome, and so I have no complaints, and I appreciate a good landlord. But at the same time, I mean, I think it's only a matter of fairness. I mean, tenants in this state have been, being screwed one way or another for years, and landlords, I'm not saying that they haven't either, but at the same time, the market has, and Andrew can talk about this, the rental market is like grown by double digits in the last decade since the last recession. And if people were lucky enough to buy in and start renting at the end of, after the recession.
Like 2010, 2011,
2010,
right?
Yeah. I mean, they've got plenty of money to play with, where your average tenant is like, hanging on by the skin of their teeth. So, I mean, I think I think that's part of this overall kind of reckoning in this writing of market forces, if you will. It's that things have been out of whack for so long, and now there's this huge pressure to jerk it back the other way. And I think, Liam, you said it earlier, somebody's going to be left holding the bag. And I think the threat of having millions of people, including children, on the streets is not something that I don't think it's going to be tenants this time that are going to be left holding the bag if they do come up with a deal, because it's just the idea is just unthinkable. So
yeah. So I know, Andrew, you're working on a story. You put out a kind of a call on Twitter today about how people have been or can renegotiate the rents that they have with their landlords. What have you been hearing already, and what made you decide to want to look into that?
Sure. I mean, I've been hearing a mixed bag, but why I want to look into it was last week or 2 weeks ago, we wrote a story about just kind of the overall rent in the marketplace declining. Seeing some of that, and that data is sort of off kind of asking rents what you might be expected to pay if you're going out there looking for a new apartment. And so we're just kind of interested in if whether, tenants that are seeing declines, if they go to their landlord and ask for some help, or if they, maybe come to a lease renewal, are they also getting those declines, or is rent kind of sticky for them? And so, what we found so far is it kind of seems to be a little bit of a mixed bag. Some people say they have gotten help, and they have had landlords give them a few $100 off. Others have said no, they actually got an increase. Others have said it's been flat, and these are people that are in some newer buildings in which they don't benefit from the sort of city rent control rules that have barred increases this year. And so how it sort of all shakes out one way or the other, a little unclear, but probably indications are not as easy as not as many declines, say, if you're renewing a lease than if you maybe walked across the street or tried to rent a new place.
Right.
Right. I think you mentioned this in your other story, but about Park La Brea. But some tenants have who I've spoken with have they're sitting in a building, they're actually seeing their similar unit now rented for less. They come up for renewal, they ask for back to that the sort of new rent, and the landlord says no. And so I talked with a tenant that had that happen to them today, and they're leaving, and
Yeah. And this, going back to the eviction cliff, which has been kind of the thing that's been looming over, our entire conversation, and obviously in general, right? One way I think, landlords will say to me when I interview them and associations, look, we don't like to do evictions. They're expensive, they're problematic, they're combative. It's not, it could take some time. It's not great for us. It's better to work out a deal. And so it'd be curious to me if we find, as people are, again, falling further and further behind, whether there are, kind of more of these deals to be had where, landlords just decide, look, maybe it's better to, waive 1 month and knock $100 off the rent if I know I'm going to have a guaranteed tenant who was, paying and was fine up until now, right? Versus going through the eviction process. And then, as you said, Andrew, like not seeing some rents come down, potentially not being able to find somebody to replace them. I guess it's for either of you, how, when you've been talking to landlords, what is their mood when it comes to, deciding to make some of these deals versus potentially going to the courts to work out the situation?
I was talking with a landlord the other day, and he was saying, he wants to try to work out deals with his tenants if they can kind of find they are impacted by COVID, and if they sort of work with him and show that they are having a tough time. More likely to move towards an eviction if they're think they're they can pay and they just aren't, or something like that. That runs into some issues which you could probably talk to on what the rules say on that. And what you will probably find for deals if you can't pay and if you're in a rent controlled building, you might be more likely to say you'll get a month free or 2 months free, or half off or something like that, because and this is something the apartment association is recommending to landlords, to not just actually drop the rent in their rent controlled buildings, because then you're sort of
locked in the lower rent.
And so then you're restricted on how much you can increase it, so you sort of lose that. And so that's sort of what I've been hearing. And then some landlords will say, we don't want to evict our tenants during a pandemic. And the people that have said that to me, kind of tend to be those more smaller mom and pop landlords. But they also don't know how, if they have enough people not paying, how they're going to pay their mortgages. So.
Right.
Yeah, I would say a good number of the landlords that I've spoken to, and I'm sure, Andrew, you've spoken to more than I have, but they many of them just basically saying they want to work out a deal, and and then there's been the few who are convinced that their tenants are basically taking advantage of the situation and are upset, and they're chomping at the bit to evict them. So I think that it does run the gamut. I would don't necessarily want to play with fire to find out what the answer is, but I would be curious if push came to shove, how many landlords would actually try to work out a deal with their tenants versus just outright evict them. And I'd also be curious, for those who did go the eviction route, what their thinking is in the sense of like, who do they think is going to rent from their units once they empty them? I mean, because they're still dealing with a pool where the economy is still heading in a downward direction. The unemployment rate is still high. There doesn't seem to be a lot of change in that direction. I guess, Andrew, to your point about people, the top end of the market leveling out, maybe there's some room at not the top high end, and maybe some like middle group where they feel like they can get another tenant who's moving out of some like, $4,000 unit is willing to move into a $3,500 unit or something like that, that they can, maybe there's some wiggle room in that end of the market. But I don't know, it would be really interesting to see, at least on an academic level, not like in a realistic way, what would potentially happen. But I am curious too, like what you guys both think about this idea of, because I've told one of our colleagues that I'm convinced that everybody's going to move out of the city and move to like places like Joshua Tree and Truckee because they don't have in their office. But there's probably going to be people who are just going to move out of the state too, and are questioning that particularly if they grew up elsewhere and they have other issues. I know there's been some data about people moving away. What do you guys both think about? Because I have my theory. I don't know if it's actually accurate. It's just probably based on my own hunches. But what do you guys think about people moving out of cities like San Francisco and LA and moving into maybe smaller markets that are more affordable or have other amenities or,
I mean, I've talked to, in the last few days, a few people that have done that. I guess the question seems to be, how permanent that is. A lot of people seem to say, okay, well, I've moved out of the city, or I've left LA, I've left New York, or left San Francisco, and moved back with family, or I don't have to be there for work at the moment, and why not just rent this place in the mountains or something like that? And so, I think a lot of it depends on how long this all lasts, and how how much the cities, New York, San Francisco, and LA remain like they are today, or basically return to sort of what they were. And so I think a lot of it will depend on, like everything else, the pandemic, right?
Yeah. I think at the beginning of this, and we did a story, Erika, and we talked about this even a lot before the story ran, when you were editing me. But there was a lot of thought about how, it was density. Density was the reason that this pandemic was happening, and you were obviously given what was happening in New York at the beginning, right? And that was the real risk for people. And over time, that's sort of the data and evidence has seen that being less and less of a factor. San Francisco, among the second densest place in the U.S. behind New York, has had a pretty sterling record, if you will call it, compared to a bunch of other cities across the country, including L.A. The case rates there are significantly lower, death rates are significantly lower. And then also, I think what you're seeing, and now of course the pandemic is spread into suburban and rural areas, so there's really no more one hot spot like there was in New York, but really everywhere. And I think also too, what we're seeing is it's not really about like some of the evidence and academic papers that have come out in kind of this first wave, not really so much about the amount of people in a place, but overcrowding really seems to be, in a lot of the communities that we've seen are in Los Angeles that have some of the highest case rates, are the neighborhoods where there are the most amount of people packed into one house or one apartment. And that has, again, less to do with the overall density of a place and more to do with, housing costs writ large or the kind of housing that there is, right? But I do think there is going to be this sort of idea, it's kind of going to be hard to shake, that if you're around people in a city and the city is transit, and no matter what sort of the kind of the high level academic audience or academic research says, there's going to be this feeling that I'll be safer in the middle of nowhere where my only neighbor is a cow. You know what I mean? And so I would not be shocked for there to be kind of some prevailing thought that that's where people with the means could go. And I think you're seeing that in San Francisco and New York, and some of the data, and Andrew can kind of back me up on this. But that's not really, I don't think you're seeing that in many other places, right? Where there's been this sort of exodus from the city. as you might be seeing in those two places?
Well, you're seeing a lot more. I don't have the numbers in terms of move-outs right in front of me or anything like that, and some of that moves slow. But in terms of rent declines, far greater in San Francisco, far greater in New York.
Yeah.
And there could be a variety of reasons that it's a lot more expensive. Those people might have the ability to move easier. But yeah, you've seen far greater rent declines than in those two cities than LA, which would indicate there's more vacancies and more people leaving. And so yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to see what happens. Once things start to open up, if they do, how much of that, as you say, Liam, kind of still remains. How many people would still rather have a house with not a lot of people around them because they just don't want to be as closely tied with folks.
Mm-hmm. So one more reader question, then I'm going to ask, wrap up with a concluding question for everybody. But this question is really about, do you really think they're going to actually evict this many people all at once? How are they even go about doing that? I'll give my take first, and then I'll get kind of both of your takes. My take is, well, yeah, I mean, I honestly don't think, even if there's no relief that is passed at the state or federal level, that over the next few months, literally millions of people are going to be processed through the court system. First of all, I don't think the court system itself can handle that kind of volume, right? But I do think the fear about people being displaced from their homes because they can't pay the rent, and a lot of people, like potentially millions of people, is a very much a real thing. We talk about eviction. I think people think about eviction in the sense of, the sheriff comes and, puts all your belongings out on the street, right? But that's really kind of the end of a process, or one way a process could end, when a lot of times, a landlord says, hey, you haven't paid your rent, it's time to get out, and people just leave, right? When their landlord tells them that. And I think there is certainly a large risk, even if doesn't happen, you don't see it formally in the eviction courts over the next 6 months or so. There is a large risk of this kind of displacement that I'm referencing could go on a pretty massive and unprecedented scale. So that's sort of my thought. Like, yeah, I don't know if we're going to see 4 million people processed through a court in the next 6 months, but I would not. But the volume of folks who could be displaced in the up to 1 million or more, I think is a very real fear. What do you guys think about that?
I mean, I think so, and I think it goes to a lot of what Erika was talking about. Who has the ability to get an attorney, who has knows their rights, who knows the city laws, which city law, which county law, and so a lot of it will depend on that. And I think if you don't see, if you fight it, you get an attorney, you ask a jury trial. Who knows when you're going to get that jury trial with the way the courts are, and then when we can impanel juries and how that will all work. And that jury trials can take a while at a normal time. But the process starts with a 3-day notice on your door saying you have 3 days to pay or quit. Quit as in leave. And so how many people? Those themselves aren't public records. So it only becomes a public record once the landlord files, basically a court case against you after you haven't paid in those 3 days. And so, there's a lot of evictions that get, quote unquote evictions that go on in the state, in the U.S. that we just don't know about, just because there's not data on them. And so, we'll see.
Yeah, to me, I just feel like, we're talking about somewhere between 4 and 5.5 is the estimate. Even if it's a fraction, even if it's 500,000 people, that is still more than twice, almost 3 times as many people we have, if I'm doing my math correctly, than we have that are on the streets right now. So even if it's like the tiniest fraction of that, that's still a whole lot of people. And that's just in California. That's not counting whatever Arizona does. It's not counting what Nevada does. It's not counting what all the states around us do. So you're also talking about just a huge displacement of people in general across the country. And I also think about it this way too. To Liam's point about, the number of illegal evictions, which is basically just pressuring people out, will happen. But the other idea is like, okay, so what happens to that family or that person when they try to get new housing? Who do they list as their reference? How does their down payment go up? What are their barriers suddenly to finding new housing and in this market? And so we think about just that cliff, But that's just the beginning of a long process that we're all going to be paying for in one way or another. And again, it's also putting hundreds of thousands and potentially millions of people on the street who are susceptible to COVID. The people who are grocery workers and who deliver Grubhub and who work for all of these jobs that we don't really pay that much attention to are suddenly going to be even more susceptible to a virus. And, you know, I think if anything, and like I would like to think that we've learned through COVID, that if we don't take care of those who are least among us, we are all going to suffer. And that is basically, if you want to see what continual closures will look like for the next 2 to 3 years, you put hundreds of thousands of people and make them homeless. That's the fastest way to figure that one out.
Yeah. So we're nearing 7. I'm going to wrap up with this. What are issues, aside from the eviction cliff, which we're obviously all going to be following, that you're going to be tracking now going forward as sort of the housing market and the housing affordability situation in the state, you know, continue as this pandemic continues to rage?
I mean, one thing I'll be looking on is to what extent, you know, construction falls off or doesn't fall off. And so, you know, we've talked a lot about, written a lot about, both Liam and I, about, you know, the lack of, you know, new housing units being built in the state. And so, you know, what happens with the downturn? You know, does it follow a typical recession where we'll see, you know, less building going on, and you know, you are kind of seeing that, and to what extent does that? I was talking with, you know, an analyst the other day who was saying, well, you know, if we rent might be going down now, but you know, it's also going down because, you know, incomes are going down for a lot of folks. But you know, if we stop building, to what extent, when the economy does turn back around, do we, you know, have a stark shortage again, and then, you know, start to see home prices kind of skyrocket because it takes a lot of time to, you know, get a project started, get a project up, and get a project going. So that's one thing I'll be keeping an eye on.
I think, I mean, I'm going to continue to try to look at the inequity issue and through the lens of the pandemic. But I'm also really interested, you know, obviously with Kamala Harris being our, I guess officially, I don't know if it's officially now, but our Democratic Party's VP pick, Joe Biden. I'm interested to see how this presidential campaign works out in terms of what their proposals are for housing and for homelessness, and particularly Kamala being from, you know, California and living in LA and growing up in Oakland, two of the urban areas with some of the worst problems, and what her plans are and what Biden's plans are to address this. So those are things I'll be tracking.
Yeah, a very, very stark difference between the Democratic platform on housing issues, which would include a significant increase in spending, for instance, on housing assistance, and President Trump's plan. I think most notably what he did recently was, you know, take away a rule that was passed during the Obama era that aimed to prevent or aimed to increase further integration in communities, right? So obviously a very, very stark difference between the perspectives of the federal candidates. Okay, so we'll wrap this here. So thank you all for joining us and for sharing your comments and questions. We are of course going to continue to report on the housing crisis and coronavirus in California. And if you have further questions, you can reach out to us on Twitter or email. And I'll let everybody give their Twitter handle and email, and I'll start. So my Twitter handle is @ my last name, Dillon, Liam. And then my email address is my first name, Liam, Dillon @latimes.com.
And my Twitter handle is @Khouri Andrews. So last name, then first name. And my email address is andrew.khouri @latimes.com.
And my Twitter handle is Erika_D_Smith. And my email address is erika.smith@latimes.com.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. And we'll look forward to hearing some more of your questions, and we'll do our best to answer them. And good night.